Good morning. So I want to thank everybody for attending our third webinar of our Lost in Translation series. And this is being brought to you by EIPMA. Now, EIPMA is the Entertainment Industry Professional Mentoring Alliance. It's made up of 15 organizations who together are bringing together this webinar series. Now, this is to inform people, to educate people, both on a professional level and those people who are trying to get an idea of what we do and the complexities that encounters. Now we invite all the people that are watching to check out many of our member organizations, CAS, MPSC, as well as many others. At the end of the series, if you weren't able to attend it live, it's going to be on the EIPMA YouTube channel. And you'll be able to find all the member organizations there, their websites, their addresses, as well as the Mentoring Alliance, which will be at eipma.org. So that is my beginning spiel. I want to now introduce, I have each of these. First of all, we put together an amazing group of people. I've worked with all these people and the talent is off the charts. And I'm so happy that they've been willing to share some of the things they know. So why don't I go by to the person to the right of me? So I don't know if it's to the right of you, but let's start with Scott. And then Scott, each one of you say a little bit about yourselves. And also, as you talk about yourselves, just kind of give everybody an understanding of your setup and how you're mixing speakers, using, what kind of console, though we pretty much, I would imagine everyone's use the same console. But yeah, just give a little bit of background of and context to what you're working in.
So for me,
Your turn, Scott. You go first.
Great.
Yeah, Scott
Hi,
Weber. Sorry about that.
Scott Weber. I'm a re-recording mixer. Been working in the biz for 30 plus years. Mostly mixed television. Done some feature film, but mostly television. I've started working into a sort of nice workflow of pre-dubbing at home and then going to a dub stage to do my finals. And finally got myself set up at home with Atmos, so I can do a full Atmos premix. So the stage is typical what you would expect, S6s or icons or whatever in a theatrical stage playback. But then at home, I have a throwback D command and a 7.1 setup. So I'm using sort of more music speakers, but I've tuned them so that they're the proper levels and sound correct, and I got overhead speakers and that kind of stuff. And I'm using the production toolkit to do all my Dolby rendering and monitor control. So that's it in a nutshell what I'm doing with
What kind of speakers do you have at home?
They're actually they're M Audio EX66s, if you're familiar with those.
Sure.
They're sort of a dual cone with a center tweeter, and they're more music speakers, but I love the low end on them and how the high end is, and I've just tuned them a bit so that I've gotten rid of some of the resonance frequencies, and I'm pretty happy with how that's working for me.
Fantastic. Hey, Larry, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, my name is Larry Benjamin, and I'm a re-recording mixer. Been doing the same thing about 30 years. Mostly doing television, streaming, broadcast, some feature films, but mostly in the broadcast arena. Working at a facility on the Avid S6, like most everyone else. Doing a variety of shows, 5171 Atmos, Non-Theatrical ATMOS. And I do have a home studio as well where I do some pre-dubbing in 7.1, and it's the JBL LSR 4328s. And it translates really well. And during the pandemic, we had to all kind of adapt. And it's kind of interesting doing Atmos where we have to do it in the facility in Atmos and then kind of serve the clients remotely on Clearview or Evercast or whatever format. So it's kind of been an interesting thing, which we can talk about how things down mix to various formats and sound tools to listen on.
Andy.
Hi guys, I'm Andy Koyama. I'm a re-recording sound mixer, primarily feature films. I've got a setup at home. I'm using the Barefoot MM45s with the subwoofers from my LCR. Got the JBL 708 surrounds and some 508s for the ceiling. So I can do 714 in here using Dolby Audio Bridge for monitoring. Primarily do feature films. I work for Formosa Group. We've got stages all over the damn place now. And that's all in the box now. S6 is at work and primarily mouse and keyboard at home. But I've done a couple feature pre-dub studio, but primarily I'm on the big stages.
Tom.
I'm Tom Osanich. I also mainly mix features. Have done a couple of episodic TV streaming-based shows, as well as kind of crazy variety of little weird things here and there. And over the years, been doing sound stuff for 30-something years. Let's see, I guess just recently did Black Adam. Smile just came out last weekend or something. Stars Born, Sicario, Joker. Anyways, so yeah, my home setup, I've got a 916 Atmos home studio setup. It's JBL M2s for the LCR, and then 708s around for the surrounds, and 50, is it 508s or 705s? I can never remember.
705s.
Okay, on the ceiling, and then and Crown DCI amps, all BSS, controlled. Mixing on an S6. Got 4 Macs. One's an RMU, whatever, playback machines. So works pretty good. Pre-dub there, done home theater stuff there, all that. So
Excellent. Frankie.
Good morning. How's it going? Frankie Montano. Not quite as interesting as my panelists here. I work at Universal Studios in the brand new Hitchcock mixing stage. S6 is all about full-blown Myers, Christie 4K, and the only thing I have at home is my bedroom. I keep separation of church and state. I don't mix at home. I take off my mixing jacket, and when I get home, I'm just dad.
And I'm Scott, by the way. I've been spending the last 2 months with Frankie. We've been mixing Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. And I'm a sound designer. I don't know, I'm everything. I've done some mixing, I've done sound design, I've done some creature voices. So most people know who I am. Anyway, I won't go into that. What did you say, Frankie?
And you drew the short straw with me.
Yeah. So anyway, so I want to get into this, and then it's going to be very casual. I have some questions. What we'll do is start riffing on those, and see where it goes. It's all very organic and very relaxed. So I've asked my mixer setups and formats. So let's start with the first question, I think, and let's discuss what your thoughts are, and just jump in. The differences between theatrical and non-theatrical. Because theatrical, you're used to being careful of the center speaker because everyone's sitting all over the place. Some might be sitting by the right speaker, the left speaker, far in the surrounds. But most people, when you're talking about non-theatrical, we're talking about broadcasting at this point. We're also talking about Dolby Atmos for this webinar. We're not talking about other immersive formats that are starting to pop up. That will actually be in a future webinar they're going to be putting on. But for right now, looking at what we have, what are your thoughts? Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Tom, you first.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say we have to serve many masters in terms of broadcast being able to be played on many formats. And prior to us rolling, Scott, you kind of touched upon this. What do we play back on? Do we play back on the big speakers, the sound bars, the Bluetooth speaker, ear pods, all these kinds of things? We really use the big speakers on the stage as the highest common denominator, and then we can do spot checks on these other formats, but we really have to trust. We can't try to serve everybody. There's just too many formats or too many listening devices, and it's going to sound a little bit different on each. So we have to make compromises. We have to be careful not to be overly discreet in our use of the Atmos format, and we have fun with it. We can obviously use it to help us tell the story as best we can with the filmmakers, but we have to be careful not to overly rely on things living in, for instance, ceiling speakers or strictly surrounds or what have you. So we have to make it so that it down mixes properly to the various formats lower in the food chain, 5.1 or stereo even, and also serving the masters of people on the remote end of listening. It has to be able to translate well on that, and you guys can touch on that and agree or disagree, but that's been my experience anyway. In broadcast non-theatrical Atmos mixing.
Tom, you were going to say something?
Well, I was going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate in that my experience, my approach, sort of from a conceptual standpoint, is that even though you mix into sort of smaller formats, whether that's cinematics for a game, a TV show, some web, video or something that's playing back. I think that the theatrical sensibility of how the mix is, sort of built, and the dynamic feeling of that, not necessarily using the entire same dynamic range, but people like cinematic. That's a term that is loved within the world of, like, what do you want this to sound like, feel like? They want it to be cinematic, which means big and exciting and cool. And so I think that I always am approaching it the same way I would a feature film, and then you kind of have to deal with the technical limitations of it's sort of like the size of your canvas. It's like, if the theater screen is a 40-foot screen, and now you need to put it onto a TV. Well, you want to get the 40-foot feeling out of a 77-inch TV. So you have to figure out the sort of technical limitations, but I'm just sort of alluding to the more creative side of how you deal with it. You're still going after the same creative excitement. And so from that standpoint, you mentioned the Phantom Center before. Obviously, in the music world, that's kind of like a different reasoning. That's like, I'd never use that. I mean, you might for the effect of some sound effect or something here or there, but because it's battling with a piece of dialogue or something. But generally speaking, like, I'm not afraid of using any given speaker. So
if I could be the devil's advocate on the other side of things, because I mix primarily television, and we sometimes get the advantage of hearing it from week to week, how it sounds on the stage and how it goes on the air. And unfortunately, one of the biggest differences going to television is the amount of dynamic range available, or how it translates to television. So what ends up happening is, if you're mixing purely for that big theatrical experience, what happens is you end up losing background sounds, and you end up using subtleties of music and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to, I know in our case, on our stage, we'll do a stereo pass at a lower level so we can hear all that stuff plays, and we might make some adjustments on the music and adjustments on the background so that stuff doesn't get lost. So if you're purely hearing the Atmos experience, you're going to lose some of that translation when someone's listening at home on their TV speakers at 75. They're losing a lot of those subtle details. So I think it is important to check. And I will also say, my experience with the way that the renderer folds things down, it's very good. So a lot of those things that you put in the surrounds and the overheads and stuff, they end up actually coming through really well in 5.1 and stereo and stuff. So I think you can trust the process about how that's going to come down and translate.
It's interesting, guys, that so for me, I'm mostly a theatrical guy. Just recently, I had the opportunity to mix Maya and the Three, and before all this, I started in music. So LA2As and 7, you know, all these plugins and toys had meanings, having a Pultec, you know. So now we're going to film, we do our theater thing. And then I said, well, how, you know, how do I want to go about this? So I started going back to the music stuff because the speakers are smaller. So how do I get that extra punch? How do I get that extra snap? What we used to do a kick and snare and the tricks we used to do. How do I make that sound punchy in a home consumer area where in theatrical I would basically rock a room. So when we took, let's say, like when we did Pacific Rim, we had to take that and try to figure out how to make that translate. So then you know, it's one of the reasons, by the way, I put on this webinar is because I love to put on webinars about conversations I don't know. In other words, I want to know from the experts, what do you guys do? And how is this different? Because as we know, streaming is starting to become a very dominant force of entertainment of how it's being distributed. And God, I love film. It's always been my love and it'll still be my love. But there's no doubt saying that the studios are spending a significant amount of investment in people to win the streaming wars. Who's going to do it? And so it's definitely a conversation. There's been a lot of great seminars on Atmos, but I couldn't find anything really good on non-theatrical. So I thought, hey, let's do one ourselves. Let's put it on and get some amazing people here. And it's fascinating because the last seminar we did, seminar 2, were all the music guys. And they were discussing, wow, we went from stereo to 5.1, and that was sort of blowing their mind. Oh, sorry, to Atmos. And that was sort of blowing their minds in certain areas and certain not, and how it de-glues everything, because they stereo, everything glues together nicely, everything feels good. Now they're spreading it out. I did that, we were doing Pinocchio with Waller Group. Oh, it felt great at stereo, and it was, crowds were really energetic. And then I started taking each actor, put in the different speakers, and it started falling apart. All of a sudden, I didn't have that density, that energy that I had. So now I had to change things up. So who else wants to talk about, anybody else want to talk about theatrical versus?
Sure.
Frankie.
I had the benefit to go from, or maybe not the benefit, but well, my travels, I saw 2-track optical turn into 5.1. 5.1 turned into 7.1. Now we're in an immersive world. And with all those learning lessons, when we went from 2-track optical limitation, etc., an LCR S format, and went to 5.1, where we had surrounds and subharmonic, everything went into them. Just like a kid with a pack of bubble gum. All the bubble gum went into the mouth. Everything came out of the back, everything fed this up. 7.1, a little less transition, get to Atmos, everything went into the ceiling. You know, objects galore, panning everywhere. And what you find really quickly is you can't decipher that material. So now you peel it back and get into what counts, what is audible and what is an emotional feel to the film, what is maybe point source, what is omnipresent, and all those kind of subtle things. So we keep it really simple. Here at Universal, I kind of oversee the majority of the iconic up mixes or the iconic films here and do the up mixes on them, which has been a real pleasure and a joy to get back into those titles. And I coined the phrase forever master. So your home use is your forever master beyond the theatrical world, of course. So it's just that little bit of learning curve of keeping people engaged in the story sonically and not cross the gimmick line because we can. So those are the kind of the things that molded my, my mixing style for feature film, and it kind of falls through to the home use stuff.
Well, if I could elaborate on what Frankie's saying, we always talk about the pocket when you've got a movie that sounds like a movie, and because we've been through all these formats, you start to know what translations happens when it goes to the air, when you have to melt down to a LORO or an LTRT in the old days, and when the mix is in the pocket and all the music is properly balanced and the dialogue is nice and strong, you generally don't have a lot of problems when you're going to different formats. But that's just years and years and years of experience.
Sure.
Boom.
Okay, we're done. No, shit. So actually, does anybody else want to comment anything so far that we've been discussing?
Well, I would just say that that's a little bit what Andy was just saying is a little bit what I was sort of alluding to before of, you know, you can do the mix, and once you've got it, you know, as you're saying, in the pocket, then you've got to force, as we're talking about all these other things, you've got to force sort of the technical limitations. You know, you do have to balance things slightly differently. You've got to figure out, you know, one of the things that typically happens is if you're mixing in Atmos and then you're going to say 5.1, is it seems like more stuff pushes to the back, you know, and so it can disconnect some of that stuff. You know, I mean, this is a little bit like what you're talking about with the music guys feeling like things unglue in the Atmos. And the same thing can happen there where, you know, it sounds great in the Atmos, and then you go to 5.1 and it sort of unglues because you get these separate planes, a front and a back plane, and you don't have the stuff in the middle kind of like tying it together. So yeah, you got to deal with all those things. That's part of the fold down, you know, limitations you have to deal with. But
so is there anything that you do? I know that, you know, it used to be that we always, in the film side, the film was the one, we made it sound great, we knew how it translated, and it kind of is what it is when it gets to the consumer, because you weren't sure if they were just doing a flat screen TVs that had horrible stereo, et cetera, et cetera. And the choices for the consumer in the past were never very great. They had TVs. Some people, if they can afford them, had home theaters, but sometimes they weren't practical in the environments they were in. Now it seems everything from an Amazon studio that plays back Atmos to lots of sound bars, that the consumer's ability to start hearing multi-channel, basically more than stereo, is pretty huge. I'd say it's becoming quite common. If you're doing a show, so obviously we know from theatrical to, as we call it, near field. But when you've done stuff, because like sometimes Netflix will say it'll be a theatrical, but then it goes to 300 theaters, and then everything else is going to be Netflix. So much so that Netflix sometimes asks, can you do the Netflix version first and theatrical second, which we know doesn't always make sense, because you got to go from the large format to the smaller format. But do you take into account, so when you're doing that gig, do you, like, I know as a designer, I'm going to do my design differently, because when I do theatrical, I'm going to rock the room. When I'm going to do streaming, I got to make it punchy, because I may not have the ability to rock the room like I did originally. So now I've got to find other tricks and other techniques. It's the same thing as the John Bonham kick drum that sounded really big. It was just unique sounding. Any thoughts on that, on your approaches?
The way it's, I think Tom and Andy hit it on the head. It's really about dynamic range and clarity. So there's a lot of back mixing that goes on as we you know, take the highest fidelity and quality and Dolby Atmos theatrical and then get it to home use. And that's a variable which we can't control as far as the way the consumer is listening to it. But there's a lot of back mixing. So all that low level stuff, when you're mixing at 79 to 8, between 79 and 80, you know, you're making sure dialogue clarity essential, and then all the low lying stuff, music starts, music finishes, subtleties, depth of field, all that stuff you really have to attend to. It's not a transfer. You have to attend to all the subtleties that translates, and again, into the forever master, how people are going to consume this for the next 50, 60 years, whatever. Yeah. So that's really the dynamic range. For me, I use multiple steps of gain reduction. So there's not one device, you know, limiting compression, etc. So I probably have about 3 or 4 stages of gain reduction just to try to keep that dynamic range. And then obviously the back mixing and tailoring it to near field environment and making sure that the re-renderer does a great job. and in the channel-based deliverables. And then from that point on, you're just kind of tweaking and peaking and making sure stuff's not out of balance, mainly for me anyway.
Here's an interesting thing. So I know everybody theatrical, the rooms are tuned to 85, zero equals 85. When you do TV or just basically not theatrical,
Yeah.
what levels do you like to mix at?
Most of the shows
80, 82?
79. Most of the shows I do are 79. So I agree with the feature guys in terms of aesthetics and concept and all that. But doing a show that originates for broadcast and is going to end up on broadcast, we mix at 79. Otherwise, there's too much dynamic range, and you're asking the consumer at home to be the mixer with the remote control, and it doesn't work. So we try to sometimes split the difference. If there's a show that's very dynamic and has a lot of action in it, then we'll mix at 82, which is kind of the split of the difference. But most of the time, I'll do Better Call Saul or Ozark. There are punchy moments. Those shows happen to be 5-1 and 7-1 respectively, but I did Shining Girls for Apple, 79. So that way, if I do my job, you shouldn't have to use subtitles or remix with the remote control. And to touch on Frankie's point, we do use a lot of, we use the format sparingly in a simplified way. I'll do things like if there's a diner speaker, obviously there's an instance for obviously a ceiling or birds or some airs or things like that. And some of the, Mark Fishman calls it the dome, if you will, for some music tracks. But I'm careful not to put things that are not going to live well at home in stereo. And that's why we're kind of spot checking. But we do primarily live on the big speakers, even for broadcast, what's going to end on broadcast. And I listen at home and make sure that it translates well. And mixing at 79 kind of seems to mitigate those issues.
I think one of the things that sort of dictates what your monitor level is hitting the number. So if you're mixing Netflix, you got to be -7, -27 for dialogue.
Yeah.
Standard broadcast is -24 LKFS for dialogue, and it used to be more overall. So luckily now we're getting more into a dialogue weighted loudness level, and that's going to predicate how loud you're going to mix. So depending on the show, if it's a more talking head show, it's going to be 79. If you have a show with a little more action, and we found that we have to go up to 82 so we can contain our levels to keep them in check. So I think you have to have a meter up so that you can see where you're at, because most of us are used to listening. We don't look at meters, we listen to how the room is tuned. If we're at theatrical at 85, we know what it's supposed to sound like. If we're in a room and it's we're mixing 82, we know what that sounds like. But we have to use that loudness level format, because otherwise we all go through a very stringent QC process, which we all have to adhere to. And if we don't hit the number, we're going to get rejected. Exactly. So your monitor level goes hand in hand with what your delivery specs are.
Right.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Absolutely. Perfectly said. It's not pretty.
Hitting numbers is the most, non-artistic thing we have to deal with.
Totally.
I mean, it's funny. I was talking to Andy Potvin recently from Dolby about the numbers, and I'm in my opinion, Netflix is kind of like doing it the most right, where they have a -27 dialogue. And the only other thing that really is a factor is having a -2 true peak. And that's really how it should be, in my opinion. I think technologically what people have at home has improved a great deal. I mean, even if they're listening on a sound bar or whatever. And so, stuff can handle that, I would love it if everything kind of gravitated towards that instead of having the -24, but I get it, but anyhow, yeah, it can be a little disserving the project to be worrying about the numbers too much, which you're chasing your tail sometimes.
From a consumer point of view, though, the A85 spec of -24 dialogue for creative content and -24 overall for commercials works quite well. So the big problem was they passed legislation because commercials were too loud and because the content was too low. So to have some kind of something to make it all the same.
Yeah, the task metering, yeah.
the -24 spec for dialogue on creative content and 24 overall for commercials actually does work quite well, and for the consumer, it's a better experience.
Now, I know theatrical doesn't use it, but doesn't broadcast. Do you have to do with LKFS?
Yes.
So the hard part is that the end of every episode or every movie is action. So you've got these wonderful numbers going through, and then there's the big, ending where you either got dragons or big, the last, we're going to go through it. And then all the meters go for,
Well, fortunately, it's an average. If it's done the way it's intended to be. We kind of got blown out of the water when Fox decided to do act by act. And so, because you would have an act that was balls out action, and then you'd have one that was talking. And so you'd have a, 5 or 6 dB difference. So we'd either have to change it on the stage or have a mastering pass where we drastically reduced or boosted act. So I think fortunately for the most part, most of them is an average of the overall show. So it does give you the ability to have softer and louder sections of the program.
That's right. And I agree with Tom. I think Netflix does the best job of not decimating the project sonically. It seems to be the truest, most transparent translation of the streamers anyway.
We just
wreck the mix.
Thumbs up.
I just did a series that initially we were believing that all we really had to do was essentially what the Netflix spec was. So from the get-go, all episodes were -27 dialogue, no problem, because we knew we were hitting that, and I basically mixed that way anyway. So so the problem was they then enforced that we had to hit -20 LKFS and 20 LRA and other, so all these numbers, all of them at once applied to you. And so we had some episodes that, without doing anything at all differently from what we wanted to do, met the numbers. And then we had other ones that were wildly out of spec because there was so much action in those episodes that it just didn't fit, And so that's where it breaks when you try to force these other numbers. And really, I think it should be all about the dialogue anchor, because if you're mixing properly and the medium you're delivering for, if your dialogue is right, then you should be good to go. And that was kind of the intent originally of those things. And yeah, commercials did mess us up.
Now, do you ever do any tricks where, because with the Netflix format, it's off the center speaker dialogue. So have you ever diverged or done anything to the left, like taking the dialogue center and putting a little more left and right to raise the volume up a little bit so when you got a much more action-based mix, it sits a little bit better, so you have a little more dynamics?
I have not done that.
Okay,
I'm not sure it's only the center speaker.
Not to say it's no, it might be a great idea. It's just something I haven't done, but I'm willing to try it. It's here to learn. So,
I wouldn't do some weird thing just to try to trick the box,
right?
Because that would probably just sound weird. But also I don't know that it only looks at the center. I think that's a Dolby based thing that kind of looks at the whole.
Most of the loudness level is based on a 5.1 re-render.
Yeah.
So
Probably cause problems on your stereo fold down too.
That's true.
I had the thing on Maya where all my characters were screaming, so everybody was speaking like this, and doing that at -20, plus or minus 27, so I get up to 25. But it was always hard because you bring it down, then when someone would speak, you still need the relationship of I'm yelling, I'm not. So that became very challenging on the dialogue standpoint to be able to balance those. Yeah, it's an interesting format. So ceiling. Okay. I know you guys talk about it ceiling's really iffy. I mean, it's sometimes iffy in theaters, but definitely in consumer homes, because a lot of the speakers are bouncing off to get the Atmos situation. So you don't know what kind of ceilings, do arch ceilings, cottage cheese ceilings, angled ceilings, you know. And I know the studios don't work because they're all acousticized. So when you listen back, let's say on a sound bar, because it seems the most common format, do you shy away from the ceiling more than you would theatrical, or it doesn't matter?
Well, theatrically, we're gonna build it for that, you know, for that format, the theatrical experience, immersively. When we down mix, obviously you're down to a dot one, so you're looking at, you know, left front, left rear overheads, and just making sure they're apparent, that we can feel them in the mix. So sometimes they disappear. It's hard to decipher depending on the sound. So just make sure that they're apparent. And like I move from room to room so that they're, you know, properly tuned and smaller stages with, you know, with hard screen and JBLs from Meyer to JBL, etc. So it's a lot of back mixing for what we do, the translation wise.
Yeah.
Is just make sure that low level material, ceiling, so on and so forth, any objects. Again, those objects are either they're dynamically being panned, they're subtly being panned, they're static, or they're omnipresent. So it's just kind of season to taste, really.
Yeah, I know early on when the whole Atmos thing was starting, we were doing Pacific Rim and Michael Keller was doing Iron Man. And I remember him running down to the theater, just seeing how it translated. And he was like, shit, ceiling's gone. Or the ceiling's just not playing the way we thought it was. Because again, it's early on. And as we know, theaters don't always tune it the way they should. So it did change some of our approach on Pacific Rim and on how much we wanted to rely on the ceiling, because we realized that if you put certain important information there, it could be lost. So that's why I wasn't sure what your thoughts were when you're really digging, not from theatrical to non-theatrical, but when you're really optimizing for non-theatrical, do you just, hey, you know what, we're just gonna do the way we always do it, and the better systems you'll hear it, the other ones don't? Any thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I actually did a project called El Camino, which was a Breaking Bad movie that was Netflix project. It was only theatrical for 2 weeks. So we had to serve that master, and we mixed it in theatrical Atmos, but then the rest of the time that lives in perpetuity, forever home, in non-theatrical Atmos. So, and I did a ballsy thing, kind of leaned into it. There was a pit and there was a low shot. Jesse Pinkman was in the pit, in the concrete pit, and Todd was above. And I did lean into using the ceiling. And I obviously did a lot of tests to make sure that it down mixed fine to 5.1. The re-render, Scott said, does an exemplary job of doing that. And I tested it to make sure it further down mixed fine. And it did. And I just have to, you know, I understand what you're saying, and we have to be careful to not be overly discreet, because it could go away. And that was dialogue, and that was a tricky thing. But I don't want to overly compromise the creative process just because of the technical limitations that some places may not play it, you know, properly. We have to assume that places should, or at least at home, you have the ability to make sure that it does translate. And I tested it on various formats, you know, bookshelf speakers, you know, a 5.1 near field setup, as well as even sound bars, and it worked. You know, I was very careful to not, you know, go too crazy with it, but yeah, I did lean into it, and it worked well.
I think
the down mixes work. The down mixes work. They're good.
Yeah, they really are.
You know, I think when you're mixing sound effects for television Atmos, it's good to find distinct effects that you're gonna hear. You can, you know, it's going to be a bird that's going to be up in the top left side. You actually want to go overboard and have something that's really over the top so that you might actually hear that. It's going to be a siren that's, you know, or an airplane that's going to go over top, because the subtle stuff, especially with up firing speakers, is not necessarily going to translate. So subtle ambiances and verbs and that kind of stuff is not going to make a lot of difference. But if you have a point effect or something that you can put that's really going to stand out, then they might start hearing that that format. I'm actually maybe off the subject, but I'm not a fan of the 7.1.2 bed. I think the 0.2 in a bed is useless. I would rather mix in 7.1 7.1 And the only time to get to the ceiling is to use an object and make an effort of exactly where I want to put it. I don't want to just to put left and right overheads. I want to put it somewhere, and and then keep everything else in beds like we've been mixing.
I think what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, I don't mix anything in 712 beds, all 7-1. Pretty much everybody I work with and around does the same thing. And I think also what you're saying about picking the sounds that you're going to put in the overhead, or even side surrounds for that matter.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that a lot of the aesthetics you're talking about, I do theatrically. Like, I think there's no point to creating a mush of a bunch of stuff that's around us. I want to hear like details and specific things. And so I think there's a lot of those choices are very similar, you know?
So,
Exactly. I mean,
No,
when you
go
look,
ahead.
when you look at, it's kind of, when you look at theatrically, when you look at an Atmos array, it is an hourglass. We have this wide LC, left and right on the screen, and we have wide back surrounds. And the surround array is wide. And when you look at the overheads, it really kind of is an hourglass shape. So you go from wide to narrowed back to wide. So it's not like 3 LCR rings across the ceiling, which would have been ideal for application for film anyway. So with that said, I'm constantly sharing the surround array with the overheads. I'm never 100% overhead. I'm always at 80% and 90% and 70%, depending on the effect, the music, etc. So I'm kind of sharing that width and that depth of field, that instead of, isolated in overheads, it gets smaller. It's not as wide. It's not as effective. Point source material is a little different, but as far as, width, I'm not solely in the overheads.
So here's a good transition to this question. So obviously you've got your beds and you've got your objects. When the editorial department is delivering material to you, have they prepped objects for you already? Do they just create a bunch of object tracks for you that you could drag the sound down and then place it where you want? What is your ideal format that you can talk to the editorial group and say, here's how I like to work?
I drive the material down. Once I know what's happening, DM&E and what's effective, to Tom's point, is the same idea. Is if you can't hear it, why do it? If it's distracting, it's not telling story, why do it? So it has to be, select material that you can feel and adds to the story. So that's why I kind of deal with it. So I drag it down, copy the automation down, bring it in, and then try to figure out exactly what's most effective. My reverb are kind of dome. So the reverbs are dome, but point source material is drag and drop and then panned.
I don't think editorial necessarily knows what we're going to do on the stage. So they can cut the same way they've been cutting in stereo, with monos and stereos, just more choices, because you may want to take certain things and put up top and certain things and keep in the beds. I do a combination of drag and drop, and I also pre-assign in my various groups, A, B, C, D effects, and pre-assign them to an object bed so I can automate groups of tracks. So if I want to take 3 or 4 tracks and put them on a single object, I can automate them and then go down to that distinct object track and do the automation for those 3 or 4 tracks. So you leave yourself options of what you can do with groups of tracks, either combination of them or dragging and dropping them to a specific track.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I do the same thing with music, drag and drop is needed. And you guys, Scott, you spoke about this earlier, how Atmos for just music can unglue the experience. And the same thing can happen with us mixing score or songs or things like that. We have to be careful to make it so that it's not just all, a separate mess, that it all kind of gels together. So at least I'm very careful of, what elements I choose to do that with. And to Frankie's point, we do a lot of that can help be helped with just the reverb, kind of the dome reverb, as opposed to even just specific elements.
Andy, Tom, any want to weigh in?
Yeah, I've got a set of sends in my session, so I can send any music track to a set of object auxes. So I don't have to move stuff around, just simplifies the session. Although it does eat up HDX.
What's
really
HDX now? Isn't that
fast.
gone?
With those, I wish it was. But those buses eat up the HDX cards real fast.
I try to, although I do have some sort of base template type thing, I try to work with whoever is doing the editorial to really say, hey, look, I want you to be able to work the way that works best for you, and I want to be able to then apply what I need to do to that. And so I usually am trying to say ahead of time, somewhere along the line, like, how can we kind of like put these two things together, so it's not just like hey, this is my template and this is my way, and it's also not like I don't know what to do with this mess you've handed me. So you know, and you know, nowadays I'm mainly doing dialogue and music, and so yeah, the music's very much that way, where I'm working with the music editor and saying, you know, hey, can you do this, and can you avoid this, you know, depending on, you know, the show. It's like having a whole bunch of 5/1 stems and I'm going to be mixing in Atmos is a nightmare. Because, you know, you can't really do anything very well, very easily. And so if those were in quads, or if maybe certain beds are set up that way and other things not, because like, hey, we don't really need that synth thing to be taking up a 5/1 stem when it's really just a stereo thing.
Do you unfold those then? Because I know that I'll get a 5/1, it'll be just a stereo track inside a 5/1 embed. So then do you just split to mono and then rebuild it?
Yeah.
Or you span it?
I mean, yeah. Depends on the sounds, it depends on what it is, because I'll either spanner it and it's basically a bed thing, or it's, yeah, break it up and make some objects here, and then, you know, if I'm dealing with effects, you know, which I used to do a lot more, like Scott was talking about, I'll have dedicated, like for every, say, effects pre-dub, I'll have a dedicated couple of tracks that are hard assigned to objects, and then all the other tracks in that pre-dub are, you know, the objects are assigned to those same objects, so that you can automate toggling whether you're going to the bed or the object with that, and it just combines with those, and it's super fast, it's super easy. And you know, just depending on who you're working with, either they have a good sense and already know some things that should be objects, or more often than not, they don't have the time to deal with that. And so I say, don't worry about that, we're going to throw these couple tracks, I'll just grab stuff and quickly, you know, throw it up on there, and if we want to combine other things, we automate that, and that's, you know.
I think it goes along with the same thing when we ask an editor not to do volume graphing, or, you know, the same thing, you know, so use clip gain, don't use volume graphing, and use stereos and monos, don't use 5/0s, because that gives you more flexibility and potential when you get to the mix of what you can do with it.
You guys are the opposite of me. I want it all done where I can kind of watch the movie. I don't want to do all that stuff you're talking about, but I would also like to say, is I think when people say Atmos, you automatically go to objects and overheads, and we get a great benefit of the surrounds.
Yeah.
Without objects applied. The extension, the frequency extension in the surrounds is significant.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to throw that in.
But you lose that, don't you lose that when you go to non-theatrical?
Yeah, but that's not, we're not, yeah, but the forever mount, you know, the foundational piece is built.
Yeah.
And then everything is the down mix from there. So at least in my travels, I don't, you know, I start theatrically and kind of live in that world daily. So
Yeah.
But you do get extended dynamic range because all the speakers are bass managed. So
Oh,
you have
right.
full frequency overheads, full frequency surrounds. Everything's going to low frequency in a home theatrical setup.
Do you then worry then on the other side of getting overload? Because I remember, when DTS was around and all the stuff, you couldn't hear it in the surrounds once upon a time, and then it would all fold into the sub, and you'd be like, we're getting overload into the sub because nobody was hearing the full range from the surrounds. Do you ever worry about how that's going to fold down?
I don't.
And I think the re-renders sound great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good replication of the mix in its native format.
Right.
And Scott, you and I talked about that prior to Pinocchio, and my experience is I don't know if it's an acoustical effect, but it really just feels full-bodied and it still feels immersive, even though it's channel-based conversion at that point. It's a 7.1 or 5.1. So
I think
it still sounds there to me, but
yeah, great.
I think it makes a little difference on your approach to mixing, because it used to be I used to use a lot more chains and overall compression on a thing, but now because you want the same sound to sound, whether it's going to the bed or the object, you want it to be the same. So I might have more channel compression or EQ, and basically the bed master is just a limiter to keep it from going over. So I have choices of whether bed or object, doesn't really matter what I'm doing in my mix.
Okay, my questions here. This is great, by the way. Thank you for everybody putting stuff in. So let's talk about your setups at home.
I'm out.
Thanks, Frankie.
This is nice meeting you all. Or
Oh,
seeing
no,
you.
actually, you know what? Before we do that, actually, I did want to have a conversation. So there's been a lot of discussions, folders, pain in the ass or not pain in the ass. Frankie, you got to wait.
Yes and yes.
No, I mean, because I know, see, the thing is, I do a lot of folders, but there's a certain hierarchy that you have to stick to, because if you don't, you lose option to solo. So, and what's everybody's thoughts?
So I can't talk.
Not yet.
My biggest first thought would be, why isn't the basic folder show you meters of everything that's in it and give you a fader that's essentially a VCA? Right?
Well, isn't that you have routing folders and you have the basic
No, because
folders?
then you're going through that bus. I don't want to go through that bus. I just want a VCA.
I think it's redundant. I think it's a good tool for editorial, for showing and hiding tracks, but I think it doesn't work for mixing. I would rather, if they want to use them for editorial, I'm going to import it into my template without any folders.
I do the same.
When we're mixing, we want to see everything. I don't want never.
Agreed.
Right.
So I'm getting a sense here.
Can I talk now?
Because I've been living, no, Ken, not yet, Frankie, because I've been living with Frankie for the last 2 months.
Has he complained about him a little bit?
A little bit.
Okay. Has that changed your approach, Scott, in terms of going forward? No. Okay.
So I'll say this, that the way and I've worked with a lot of you here, so a lot of you know kind of my style. I do everything via categories. So I don't do effects 1, 2, 3 because that makes my mind blow up. So I'll do, weapons, vehicles, creatures, whooshes. So I have a lot, kind of what pre-dubs are. And I build them out. So if I have a lot of tracks on a show, which I tend to do, most of the mixers I've ever worked with find it very, they're all laughing. I'll go 1,000, 2,000 tracks. I don't care. But they're all easy to mix because they're all laid out. So your hand, once you do reel 1, you know where to go and what to expect, because the whole show is built the exact same way. So rather than, I could destroy a mixer with 16 tracks if you randomize it. And I've seen people do that. 2 tracks. Yeah, Frankie's been through that too. But I try to make it very predictable. So you always know, because a lot of the shows that I do tend to have very distinct categories. Pinocchio actually didn't. And that was a very interesting, because there's a lot of miscellaneous, but we had certain areas that we can categorize, but there was a lot that wasn't. So for me, they were easy to mix. So yes, from my standpoint, I liked folders because it was very convenient to organize and color code. And I could give you 4 folders that were colored the same way, so you knew they were tied together visually, so you could understand my intent. But I'm not delivering way more than mono and stereo. I'm delivering lots of things. As you know, yeah, I know Andy, Tom, and Frank. We've mixed a lot together and or worked together, and they know, for better or for worse, you know, they know my hell. So.
Well, I think we got to
Okay.
give Frankie. We got to give Frankie the.
No, I was
floor
gonna say now Frankie can talk now.
Yeah, so counterpoint and rebuttal. It is organized. I think the re-recording mixers on this panel can agree, or we can all agree, that organization is huge in our efficiency. That's how I measure my daily production, is how efficient was I today? Was I at a 80 percentile clip, or was I searching and destroying and re-editing and muting and just wrenching away at a 20 percentile? So I can see where the folders, you're talking about the master folder and the subfolders, and you start digging down deep. And what was biting me was the ability to inline solo a track and hear it without getting the master solo reverb from other tracks. And I could never really navigate, like, I just want to hear this track. So ultimately I ended up just with a scrub tool if I wanted to solo material, is get to the track, scrub it, go, that's the one. Because if, to Andy's point, wanting to see stuff, hugely important, can't live without it. But I could go into overview on the master folder and at least see that there was something there from that aspect. But the solo, the master folder, the subfolders, and the solos was really a hindrance.
So do you guys
I still love you, Scoots, but it was.
Oh, that's fine. So now the thing is, a year ago or less, we used auxes. So we had aux tracks and inside the aux tracks, similar to what we do with folders,
yeah,
they would contain the categories. Did you guys like that better? I know you didn't like. I know Tom used to get away from the auxes because of the lack of dynamic range and all the things that were with that.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
That used to be a much bigger problem than it is now. I mean, a while back, Pro Tools, changed the busing architecture and has, more oversampling and stuff now and floating points, so that it doesn't have the limitations it used to have. It used to be that you could be feeding a bunch of stuff into a bus, and depending on how you had the aux versus the master and everything structured, you could be just crushing that bus and never see a peak light go on because it was clipping the bus before what you were seeing and doing to the bus. That's not so much a problem anymore. But I personally tend to go with less, like having a bunch of busing going on in my session. I pretty much have, if we're looking at dialogue, it's like all the dialogue tracks, all the ADR tracks, all the PFX tracks, it all goes out the dialogue bus. Reverbs, obviously there are auxes sent to reverbs and then those go out. But there isn't some like structure where there's like multiple levels of things happening to those things. And even on effects, I don't like to have a bunch of layered, processing and whatnot happening personally, because I just get lost in that. So, if I need to do some sort of processing that's like across a whole bunch of tracks, I mean, that happens not that often. But if it does, I can tie plugins together and, filter them all together or whatever the case is. But where I do find the folders that I'm still trying to figure out the best way to use the folders, what is nice is on the S6 to be able to see sort of some overall, sort of block representation of that there is audio there. So if I'm over and I'm digging into the score, and I'm mixing the score, I can see, hey, there's no dialogue playing for a little bit here because I've got one track that's dedicated to the dialogue folder. And so it shows me that, hey, there's no clips there. Or here comes the clip and I know I got to get down because that's the line that we're going to have to hear. And so it's just on the S6. I like to work on the S6 and not so much in Pro Tools. I don't want to be mousing around in the session myself. I like to be on the surface. So they're helpful in that way, but that's why I'm saying that would be a little more useful if it was actually a VCA, that gave me a multi-channel meter on top, and I could see the sort of clips that are coming down the line in a bulk kind of way.
Yeah.
Now you can't, like, it's a separate thing. So that's a little bummer.
So with all that, when you know the monitor there, at each of you, do you rely more on the fader? Do you deal with clip gain issues? So it's going to be mouse, you highlight it, you bring down the clip because of sometimes, especially on the effects, how it's going to hit certain plugins differently. Sometimes if you overdrive in a compressor, you bring it back before the compressor rather than after it. What are your thoughts, clip gain versus fader?
I do both.
Yeah.
All day.
I think it's always a matter of both, but I do like giving editors direction to do clip gain and leave the volume automation to the mix stage. But then obviously clip gain is a great tool if you need to quickly notch down a couple things real quick. So I think, that tool is useful for both.
I do both as well.
For
And
dialogue,
Andy, you're the clip gain
gain.
monster.
I'm all clip gain dialogue, so I want to get at it before I hit my inserts. So dialogue is 99.9% clip gain for me.
And I've noticed that I've worked with Andy a lot, in the not too, I noticed that you do have the monitor much more closer and that you are sculpting, especially dialogue, the lines, and so much interesting way you work. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I like to get really into the minutia. For dialogue, I almost never touch faders. It's all mouse and keyboard. I only use faders for music cues, basically. But I tend to do a lot of stuff inside Isotope, like de-essing, and I like to ride clip gain a lot for rather than compression on dialogue.
Yeah, it was always amazing to watch you work on that. Very, very cool and different way of working. Anybody want to jump in, Scott or Larry?
Yeah, Andy's right. You have a lot of into the minutia. You can go with clip gain in terms of if you want to get a syllable that needs to be raised. It does give you that kind of level, that fine level of detail. I'm more faders though. I just don't have we don't have the luxury of time as much as you guys, I think, in terms of the broadcast stuff. So I'm kind of doing it on the fly with faders. But a combination. Clip gain is great on the fly. You like a move, you just want to quickly on the fly lower it, raise it, and get in there for certain things. You can kind of help a performance. Or dig things out faster than I could with my fader, but better level of detail. So a combo.
I think when the other guy's working, you can clip gain stuff when he rewinds.
I think that's the case. I think on the initial pass, I want to have faders. I want to have access to everything at once, so I can grab multiple things at once and get a balance, especially for backgrounds or complex effects or whatever. I use everything in VCAs and I spill out to get to faders. But then if I'm doing a playback and we went by something that's too loud and we're still going, I can just grab that thing and clip gain it back and know that it's fixed for when we come back.
Yeah.
Excellent. As we talked more about, you mentioned something, Larry. So honestly, now that we're talking about non-theatrical Atmos, we understand the whole theater side. So films, they have their own dynamics and budgets and timelines. For when everybody is doing a broadcast project mostly, because even the Netflix stuff is it film? Is it broadcast? It's a fine line. Depends on the show and who the director is, I would imagine. But do you get more time when you're doing an Atmos mix?
That's a great question. The budget's a little bit more because there's a little bit more allotted for editorial. I work a lot with Nick Forshager. He does specifically cut elements that are going to be used for Atmos drag down. Some of it is assigned for that specifically, because obviously time is of the essence. Not necessarily. And that's why we can't be over, we have to kind of keep it in a simplified way. And we find shortcuts to be able to do it efficiently. But yeah, not necessarily. It just depends on the show. I'm doing a show with Ryan Johnson next week. We have 5 days to mix a show, which it's not any more complicated than a show that I do that's 3 days. But because of who he is, he has an extra couple of playback passes and things like that. So we will have a little bit more time to finesse. But in a show where I have 3 days to finish it, including playbacks, I have to kind of pick and choose my moments creatively and what will serve the story to use the format in the best way. So we're not getting overly discreet and overly what's the way of saying it, gimmicky. I don't want to make it gimmicky. It's really, my partner will do things with backgrounds and certain effects that will serve the format, but also the story. And I'll do the same thing with music. And obviously, if there's certain elements, there's a loop group on a balcony, or obviously reverb treatments and things like that. But we don't necessarily get more time. It just depends on Apple. Every show is Atmos. That's their delivery requirement. It depends on the production company. MRC, we don't get any more time. If it's a Netflix for Netflix, maybe we'll get a 4th day, knowing that we need a little bit more time, it being Atmos, but generally not.
Anybody else want to jump in under that, Scott or Andy or Tom? Or
generally, my response to that is that it doesn't really take much more time. It's not really a factor of time in the mix. Correct. To deal with Atmos versus a 7-1 or 5-1. It does take a little bit more time to master it, because you have to make an Atmos master and a 7-1 5-1. Right. But once you've, as we've all now done enough of them, it's like you've figured out how to do it, and so it's not really a big time consuming thing. I mean, does it take time? Yeah, it takes a little bit of time to deal with those things, but it's pretty minor,
It is pretty minor. It's more, I feel bad, it's more for the deliverable side as well.
And that was my next question, so it's great.
One more thought on that. I think.
Oh yes, please. Yes,
even just with a 5-1 mix, we want to get as much detail as we can of the mix. And part of our process where we have 2 mixers sitting in a room at the time, sharing speaker space, trying to blow through a show, unlike we're a typical theatrical mix where we have days and days to pre-dub stuff. We have to figure out creative ways in order to get all that detail in. So, either your effects mixer is going to have to work in headphones to try to get some of that done. And that's where, going back to having a home studio, I don't come in on day one. I stay at home and do my pre-mix so that my dialogue mixer has a chance to go through and get through the show and clean out all the noises. And I have the time, especially if it's a bigger show in Atmos, I can play with some objects and get some things worked out in my pre-dub before we come together. So, in this world of get a lot done in a shorter amount of time and make a more complicated mix, we have to start thinking of ways in how we can get more detail and more work done in a shorter amount of time.
So I'm going to go to deliverables in a second, but since there's a lot of dialogue people here. So who does isotope? Editors, mixers? Who's got the time? What are your thoughts?
Combo both. I tend to prefer to be able to do it, because I think sometimes editors, God bless them, they're getting better at it, but sometimes they feel like they're not hearing it against backgrounds or effects or music even, and so maybe they'll overdo it and overprocess. Obviously, we all want to do the least amount of damage, and it's they tend to kill an ant with a bazooka when you want to have a light touch. So I tend to want to try to reserve it for the mix and know that you can get away with a lot more control with even just EQ and levels and things like that under really good backgrounds. And so, but yeah, I do isotope. I'm sure everyone on this panel is well versed in it and competent at it.
I use it for all the Universal Classic, up mixes on those films. So, because it's interesting to go back into Jaws and go back into Back to the Future and rebuild them and bring them up to, at least in the ballpark of current fidelity of those tracks. So yeah, it's a interesting process. to go back in time and hear what we were doing back then.
I've got to just ask, so you guys will laugh when I ask the question, but it's an interesting question. So for those noise reduction programs like Clarity Pro, that are but that are live, they're very mixer centric. So with Isotope, you take it, it's destructive editing, meaning that, you know, I've now changed it, it's embedded. Where something like Clarity Pro is something you could change, it's all automatable. What are your thoughts about those kinds of technologies?
Once I got my hands on it, I made a pass on Jaws, and it was pretty amazing. So much so, in some of those sequences, the backgrounds are now lacking. So we're gonna have to make another pass to cut just the barge sequences. Some of the noise floor was greatly reduced with really not much damage to the original dialogue recordings.
Yeah, for real time, it's pretty amazing. But
Yeah.
I always find if I have the time, I can beat it with Isotope.
Yeah.
Tom?
I've used both. I think as well as some other things. It's a great tool to have in the arsenal, you know, Clarity specifically. And that's kind of true of all of them. Like, it's great to have all these options. In my experience, you will have something you'll come across with any one of them that you're blown away. This thing's amazing. I can't believe it works so well. And another thing that you're like, I cannot make this thing sound good no matter what I do.
Sure.
You really need to have, you know, multiple
Right.
options.
Yeah.
And, you know, like Larry was saying, it's like, it depends on the show and what else is going on. When you've got backgrounds going on and whatever, then maybe you don't need to process something as much, you know, because the natural noise that's in there is totally fine in that scene. And you don't want to mess with the quality of the dialogue. So it's really like, the other thing I would say about Clarity is it's less real time than you think it is, because you can only run a couple instances of it before your machine chokes and dies. So you know, what I found, I recently did a show where it was a super noisy production track that I was handed, and I had to do something, and it was a, you know, lower budget movie, so I didn't have time to, you know, like dig in deep with, you know, RX or whatever through all these different scenarios. And Clarity was a great solution for a lot of it, but I had to freeze tracks.
Sure.
Because Clarity couldn't be live with more than a couple of instances, and that was a giant pain in the butt. Have the frozen tracks. So
just to interject,
Yeah.
the dialogue denoise that's part of RX actually works really well as a live thing. So
Yeah.
if I'm mixing dialogue, a lot of times I'll put those inactive tracks on all the production dialogue tracks and make them active, and you can sample noise in sections and automate that very well. It's sort of a real nice real-time tool.
Yeah, I do a lot of work, obviously, with Waves and Isotope. They're all dear friends of mine. And when we were putting together the Clarity Pro, and I was working with them on that project, the question came up, you know, how does it compare to Isotope? And I just basically said two different tools.
Yeah.
One's not going to surpass the other. So no matter what they were trying to create, I thought the Clarity brought some fascinating advantages for what it does, especially, you know, like a Cat, was it Cat 45 or
Cat
Prod-
43.
yeah, the old Echo, yeah. And
And
so
he still,
what's that?
he still has one.
Oh yeah.
I got about 8 of them, but they're in the storage now.
But it was, and when I was guiding them, I thought Clarity added another tool that works well with Isotope. So it's not, I didn't think they were going to compete head to head per se, but I thought that mixers were going to want, and editors were going to want both. I think it was a great addition to the tools that we have in what we do. I know we have 12 minutes before we get to Q&A. I had a couple questions I can ask this question, and we'll keep it short, but I know we can talk 2 hours on it. What are your feelings about all the QC issues that we're now having to deal with in streaming? That you do a film, somebody analyzes it, and then you get, pages of notes, and then they do the visual effects update, and you get another page, several pages of notes. How, and the question becomes, how do you bill for it? Do you just, a day is a day is a day? How does, and it becomes an unpredictable amount of anticipation. Like, how much time do we predict for QC adjustments? And who's actually
Well-
doing the QC adjustments?
Well,
Thoughts?
we just got off, we're working together now. And we're doing a picture, and I'm sitting in this large dubbing theater and going, there's snaps, pops, clicks, ticks everywhere. If I can hear him in this environment, we have no chance. It's going to be a booklet of, one after another. So it started to, it ignited this thought of how do we change our workflow? And you saw it happen on Pinocchio, Scott.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Crash the 5.1 down, middle of the mix, send it to QC. Get it back, 150 things. Allowed us to, boots on ground, editorial staff is still here, recording staff is still here.
Because
have
we're
the-
dealing with a wood puppet that creaks, snaps, and
every-
clicks. So there's no QC problems on this show.
So, yeah, exactly. So my goal is, at least theatrically, my goal is to QC the ingested material right off the bat. So we know, even before we start mixing. Soon as a reel is complete, send it to QC, get it back. And work that into our workflow, because when we blow by our drop dead date over and over again of turning the mix over, we blow right through it.
So
We
here's the
rarely
question I've
hit
got. So here's the question. Sorry to interrupt you on this. Do you charge for QC notes?
That's a sticky wicket, because when you're going back to studios, especially if we're a non-universal picture and we're going to someone else saying, hey, we have all this QC report came back, we have to address these line items, we need a couple more days to do so. And it becomes a rub. It really does. But we paid you to do this job. And part of that job is to deliver it in all facets, including QC. Plus, we don't have the time, because the deliverable is this date. We blew by that, and now it has to go out. So my thought is, what I just said was to QC it throughout the process, get feedback, attack those changes. You saw it happen on Pinocchio. You saw exactly what happened on Pinocchio. Yep. And if we can mitigate, we're never going to get out of it, but if we can mitigate it to a half a dozen notes at the very end, it's manageable. If it's 200 notes at the very end, it doesn't work for us. So we have to change our workflow. We beta tested it on Pinocchio.
We shall see.
We shall see, but it is a step in the right direction. So I really want to QC the ingested material, DM&E. What do we have? What are we doing? Can somebody look at it offline? As soon as we're done with it, same kind of process, even if it's internal. Same process, at least to be able to understand, especially post-conform. You're talking about automation snaps and all kinds of other delectables that is going to bite us, especially with the sound theater. So that's kind of the thought.
Frankie, I've done 3 projects recently that all had QC issues, and the issue is not. In some ways, you got to fix it or not fix it, but somebody has to go at least check them out. Whether it's on the stage or offline, it still takes labor, and we're all based on we're on time and materials. So whether it's a mixer doing it, an assistant doing it, somebody's got to take it, and it can't be free because that person has to get paid. So what are your thoughts, both at Andy and Tom? I know, Formosa and Warner Brothers.
Well, fortunately, I don't have to worry about it. I get paid when they come in to do them. So But I find myself during the mix
Get them out.
on playbacks listening for clicks and pops and not listening for creative issues because I'm paranoid about it.
We've done a little bit in the last, I don't know, handful of things, it seems. A little bit of what Frankie's talked about, but just internally, where we've had like, hey, let's get one of the designers or one of the editors as we kind of finish we're nearing the end of the project. We know we're going back into reels for updates, but we're within the last few days, and just have them take the 5 ones or the 7 ones and just watch them down in design rooms. There's definitely stuff you hear on a near field environment that you don't hear in a theatrical environment. The natural reverb of a room will take out some of the little snaps and things you just will miss. And if you get a young person to do it, they'll hear more stuff than us too.
Of course.
or someone
We always
listening
want
to
12-year-olds to listen,
Right. But Scott, that brings up a good point. Sometimes the the sheer quantity, the tonnage of QC notes is specific to the person doing the QC. So if you get someone at the same company, they may come up with a dozen QC fixes, and someone else at the same company might come up with 120. And like you said, it takes time to go through and vet all that. And we try to pre-vet that and have someone do that. Is it billable? Sure, I'm over at Signature, and it like you said, it's a sticky wicket. He said, because it's supposedly it's like doing a home inspection. We're delivering this product, free of defects, but who's to say it's a defect or creative intent? Sometimes it's not just ticks and pops. It's someone's making a judgment call where they really have no business making a judgment call. But it still takes time to listen and vet that note.
We when I was doing my end, the 3. Because that thing was, to be honest, as busy as Pacific Rim for me. There were so many gods. It was just so much going on. And every time they had a picture change, because they were constantly updating, even color timing, anything, it would go through the QC process. And this went on for 3 weeks.
Wow.
And, and then it was just like, hey, you know what? And it was be different things every time. And most of it, like 99% of it, wasn't technical. It was a creative choice.
Right.
But the time it took 3 hours to go through, just listen to it, try to figure out what they're talking about. And so I think it seems to be a challenge. It seems to be a big challenge and a new dynamic that we all need to agree on, as far as post-production facilities, producers, post soups. There needs to be, I told on Pinocchio, said, we have to set money aside for QC, or you need to tell QC no, because either way they're going to find things, and most of the things they find were irrelevant, and some things aren't. And theatrical is a little different than near field, because every film I've ever done, when it goes to near field, you find stuff, punch-ins, panning clicks, just stuff that you just can't hear on a stage, but you do hear it on a near field process.
I mean, even 3 years ago, I changed our workflow. We do the M&E first.
Yeah,
Before
that's great. And we sort of did that sort of on Pinocchio.
Let's hear what we got, where the holes are, where the punches are, where the automation issues may or may not be, and it pays off. I mean, so that's our workflow now, is to do the M&E first, strip it out, see what's going on.
Yeah.
It's in for Universal, the explanation is easy. Rather do this workflow than call back a DCP and find out that we have to remaster. There's something going on. So
Right.
So we've been trying to take steps to manage it and understand it, and not get to a point where we can't get to it, because when you have a 70-foot throw, an X curve, and a screen, good luck finding all those things. Getting to the near field mix downs, and you're like, oh wow, we just have a bunch of them. So it's a moving target, but I think it's ultimately going to be inside our workflow prior to deliverables.
Yeah. Let me take a sideways question here. So we get our final budget time. So it's either a day of reel, 2 or 3 days of reel, somewhere in between there, and anywhere from 1 playback to 3 playbacks. So you're looking anywhere from 12 to 19 days, many times, 20
But
days.
there's 24 hours in a day, so
Wait,
let's.
Yeah, you know. So, okay, we have all that. So we all work really hard and we have so much time to be with the creatives, producers, directors, picture cutters, obnoxious sound supervisors, and work through the material. Okay. Then we got to do deliverables, which many times takes as long as it did to mix the show. What are your, and so then you're fighting of, they go, wow, the mix is a huge budget, it's really expensive. And you're like, I still need the time with the creative people. And now the deliverables have gotten so crazy. And if you have to do a Chinese version, you sometimes make a whole new version for a whole nother country. Thoughts?
Back to mono.
We are the tiniest little segment of the budget of the film. And because we're nerds, I guess they want to step on us, but it's insane that they want to squeeze us because we're like
Percentage
a
budget,
budget
50% of the movie.
Yeah, it's the tiniest little piece of the budget.
Well, I think if they had their way, there'd be only one deliverable. So
yeah,
and that is to a certain degree. I think there is a motion in that direction, right? We're going to have just the Atmos. Maybe there'll be a stereo version and the Atmos, and that's it. You just have to make something that the Atmos, downstream technology folds it down to whatever you have, and that's what it is.
The theatrical, the non-theatrical, the far end. Everyone's got to want all the formats, and then there's the Chinese version, and then the blah blah's version, and then director sometimes wants two versions, because they're not sure. I understand the film because at least the films have a certain amount of budgets to allow for things. And that's, as we're talking about non-theatrical, how does that work when you guys are doing 3 days for a mix?
Well, we do have a deliverables department that is not part of that 3 days. That's generally done after the fact.
But are you doing it, or is a mix tech or some other department?
A mix tech is doing it. We'll do it if it's something that involves creatively, if there's a rebalance, like you guys do a far field mix and a near field mix. So if it's something like that, yeah, we would get involved. But generally, if it's just making crash downs and other stems and various food group flavors and all that. To Tom's point, I spoke to Scott Kramer over at Netflix, and that is the direction they're heading, where we deliver just the Atmos, and then everything else is derived from there. And then even using AI to create different even levels, which is a dangerous thing, of course, in my opinion. But
and by the way, Scott Kramer is going to be on our next webinar.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, he's terrific. It's not part of the 3, 4, and 5 days that we have to do a show. That's a separate act, the deliverables, and then of course those are all QC'd, and you guys know as QC things come back, then you have to go and update those deliverables in various versions. That's the kind of the stepchild that doesn't want to be talked about, budgetarily.
Of course, that's why we're talking about it.
I think it's probably a little less complicated in television deliverables because we typically have a central recorder which contains most of the material already. When we get into an Atmos mix, some of those things do have to be taken care of afterwards, like the 5.1s and the stereos and that kind of stuff. But like to your point, Larry, it is something that happens by our deliverable department, where there's a mix tech or a layback engineer that's taking care of all that stuff for us.
I know we have Q&A coming up pretty much now. I just want to end it with, well, first of all, I want to thank everybody. We'll do all that stuff later after Q&A. But lastly, because as you all know, I'm a technology geek. I just eat, live, and breathe this stuff. What technology is out there that you're getting excited about? Is there anything, I'll say that I've been doing some work with something called the Sphere in Las Vegas.
Ooh.
And they have some amazing 7-story screens, immersive sound, etc. So stuff I can't talk about, but wow, that's for a special venue, that's pretty mind bending. What's out there that's exciting you guys? Yeah, Frankie.
I have a session, so I need to jump out. But what I'm hoping for is auto mix. So,
Auto what?
um, so
So an AI automatic mixing.
yeah, done. Here you
The
go.
AI, huh?
That's it. But
Some
I
intelligence.
announce, gentlemen, ladies, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you,
Look
Stefan.
forward
Frankie's
to being
mixing,
in
by
your
the way,
company.
today, and he just took 2 hours to be with everybody. So I want to thank him for carving that out.
It got me 2 hours out of Bardo, which is 3, so only have an
Yeah.
hour.
And
Anyway,
I'll see
thank
you
you.
tomorrow, my friend,
I
or
will see you
Monday.
then.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
See you.
Frank.
Andy, we'll connect soon.
Yeah, see ya.
Take care. Bye-bye.
So,
Hey,
guys,
I would
anything out there?
I would say Atmos is not that unreachable to the mortal person, and people are scared of how to do Atmos. But with a production toolkit at $300 and a Pro Tools system and even a simple speaker system, you can do Atmos, and it's not that difficult. And people are scared that they have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on lots of speakers and equipment and stuff. And really, with a basic Pro Tool system and a production suite, you can jump in and start dabbling with it and have lots of fun with making objects and mixing in Atmos.
Anybody else want to say anything?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that in terms of how we consume Atmos, I know a lot of people don't have even the setups beyond what we're talking about. Most people don't have even upward fire speakers or ceiling mounted speakers. It's either done with sound bars. I would love to see, and I've tested, it's great, headphone technology that uses binaural to give a very good representation of Atmos, theatrical and non-theatrical. And I think perhaps maybe that's the avenue that will.
I know Sony's been doing that. There's some technology, but
Yeah.
you have to physically be in the room. They take
The virtual mix environment.
years, and but it's fascinating. I was talking to Wolf Files and
It's
Jeff
wonderful
Ray about it.
Yeah, I mean, Smith has theirs, the realizer that works really well. You're kind of shooting the room acoustically, creating
Yeah.
that impulse. Exactly.
Andy, Tom,
I
I
just
think
think that,
mix in Maui or something,
yeah. Well, the coolest thing about Atmos is that the fold downs do translate all your spatial work so well, and that's why it's such a great system.
Well, and to that point, if you were even using the production suite to monitor in stereo on your stereo speakers, it's actually still taking all that stuff and giving you some semblance of stuff in surrounds and overhead. So, from an editorial point of view or even mixing point of view, you could mix with less speakers and let the renderer monitor differently than what you're listening.
Yeah, in the not too distant future, like I said, mentioned, I'm going to do another panel based on immersive audio. Because if you look at gaming and you look at TV, a lot of stuff now is saying they're mixing for headphones, but the headphones are now doing binaural and do some real exciting things. And there's a whole generation. My son, my wife and I, we sit on our lazy boy couches and watch TV and a big screen, and my son's on his iPad with headphones.
Yeah.
On the staircase or wherever.
The whole headphone, and this is kind of what you're talking about, but the headphone thing is all based on getting the appropriate head transfer function set up for your head.
Right.
And so some of that's like with what Apple's doing and whatnot is based on some generic head transfer functions, and my head is apparently not generic because it doesn't translate very well.
Yeah.
But they're doing stuff now that you sort of take pictures of your head and it builds a 3D model of your head in order to figure
Customizable HRTF. Yeah, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
That's
So I think that's one of the most exciting things honestly, the most exciting thing for me would be if I mix something for somebody to come sit where I was just sitting and hear that.
Yeah.
Right. So if we can deliver that, we've got it.
So I'm now getting beaten up over questions, Q&A. So we're 7 minutes late. So apologize for all you that have the questions, and let's get to it. Oh God. All right. So I'm gonna say names. I'm gonna be horrible at this. So, Antonius. Hey all, many thanks for doing this. Quick question, and possibly a goofy one. For the predominant TV mixers, is there ever the time for dedicated stereo mix, or as mentioned, you rely on the RMU for the down mix?
The latter. We don't have the time to do a separate
no time.
Yeah. Oh, and it's always, because I always get that, hey guys, can you do the 5-1 first and then the Atmos second? And it's always no.
Right.
It doesn't work. It always
have to
goes
start with
big
you
to small.
have to start with the biggest common denominator and rely on the down mixing to translate it for you.
Okay.
I just did a series, and those guys are the expert on that, but I just did it, and basically I spent a day or so after having mixed maybe 3 or 4 of the episodes, taking the masters from that and really trying to dial in the settings of what was happening for the down mixes, so that there was a down mix that we all listened to and were happy with, that was pretty much a set it and forget it down mix.
Yeah.
That works.
So it wasn't all based on the RMU. It was
a little tweaking.
Yeah.
Okay, we got another question from Masama. Hi all, is there a convention to the number and types of beds you use when feeding the renderer? Is it different in the theatrical versus non-theatrical world? Okay.
Well, probably not. I think in a typical recorder, you use all 120 tracks, and
Yeah.
you're going to split it between, there's going to be 64 for the dialogue mixer and 64 for the effects mixers. And you're going to take up, if you're doing dialogue music or dialogue group and music, he's going to use 30 tracks for, 3, 7, 1, 2 beds, and the effects mixer is going to use effects, BGs, and Foley, and you're going to have 34 tracks left for objects. And I think that's...
But are you guys using multiple beds? So you've got an effects bed, a BG bed, a Foley bed.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So 50-50 doesn't always make sense.
No. Sometimes I'll take less, and we'll make little negotiations and give my effects partner more, because I certainly don't need for.
Yeah, just a giant mud wrestling session. Just to,
Yeah.
I think if you're doing multiple beds, personally, if you're doing multiple beds into the RMU, I would go with a simpler like DME, 3 beds thing, so that you have more objects,
Exactly.
to play with, and to be able to, not be so cramped in your sessions in terms of allocating them.
And that also depends on what your deliverable process, or what you need to keep separate for the M&E process without having to remix the show to get isolation things. So a lot of times we separate out things so that there's separation, so that somebody offline can take care of our M&E and different things.
So I've got another question from Antonis. And actually, I had this on my questions that I forgot to ask. So thank you for asking this question. Okay. Atmos reverb or multiple stereo reverbs placed in different places. What are your thoughts on how you use reverb?
I've done both, where I've used different stereo reverbs and have them pan differently, and then I'll use something like Stratus or Phoenix Verb, or even cinematic spaces and cinematic rooms rather, and it tracks panning very well. So kind of both. I've used both to good effect.
I think in a simple sense, using a stereo pair of reverbs, because when you get in 7.1, it's sort of the front part of the room and the back part of the room are 2 entities. So if you link a pair of reverbs that maybe share the same settings, a pair works really nicely. And especially when you're doing effects, and I need to have a different one for effects, for BGs, and for Foley, that's a simpler way. But also, like you said, the Stratus 3D gives you the ability to actually go to those upper channels and objects. Those are nice too.
Yeah, one of the techniques I do is I like using a lot of stereos as well, because I like the back reverb to be a little bit longer. And one of the ways that I cut my designs through a mix, especially creatures and exotic stuff, is if I can sustain it long enough through the theater or even through broadcast, you hear it a little bit better. So it decays in the back. So it gets off that front speaker away from dialogue and music. And then you can hear it arch in the sides and rears. So a lot of times, whether it's creature, roar, it'll echo out over your head and decay somewhere back there, but gives you a fuller sound without more volume and without all the things. Andy, Tom?
Yeah, I use a combination of stereos and multi-channels, but primarily in the beds.
Primarily what?
In the beds, no, I
the
usually
beds.
don't put reverb objects.
Yeah, I mostly keep stuff in the beds. I probably lean more towards multi-channel verbs or delays and reflection stuff. But I also use stereo stuff. I mean, it depends on, the situation. But I think I do a lot of what you were just talking about, Scott, with trying to make something move to the back, spatially, but with a multi-channel, verb or delays, because you have the ability to sort of program and automate that to push back, and it's still the same
How
kind
long?
of one thing.
How long did we design together? 10 years? 5 years? Work together? It was a long
Probably,
time.
it was, actually, I think it was about 9 years. So
Yeah.
yeah,
It was great. And you were always just kicking it. Okay, Keith Elliott, how much do you rely on Cargo Cult, aka Spanner?
I like
Keith.
I like Slapper. Slapper's a great one for delays, but Spanner I use a little bit for in those instances where Tom mentioned when your hands are tied and you get 5/1 music and you need to kind of split it out. And
Or an LCR? It's like,
yeah,
exactly.
Your spanner ends up being the Swiss Army knife that you can fix things that you're stuck with, that you don't have to split out into a bunch of channels and repan them.
Yeah.
Well, I'm always getting 5/1 or 5/0 stems in music, and if without Spanner, I can't do anything.
Yeah. Spanner is, you have to have it in every session. I use Slapper a lot as well.
Yeah, it's a great plugin.
Scott, you went dim.
Yeah, you're like,
Can't hear you.
Oh, we lost.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
there we go.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That was a cool sound effect. I don't know how it happened, but.
That was
Okay.
me.
So I was going to say Epic Delay is kind of a neat delay that I use. It has 4 delays, 4 kind of reverbs, and create a bunch of presets for it. But and then Odyssey, the same thing that you guys use. I think it's kind of become standards. Somebody says we need sound bar with Dante or AS67. Sure. Okay.
Why not?
Can you all talk about how you got into immersive audio and how people can break into this area? That's a whole session to itself.
Yeah, everybody has a different path. I think immersive audio, we all kind of had to get into it because the format was foisted upon us, for a lack of a better way of saying it, and we kind of adopted it and embraced it and creatively use it and rely on it. But I think we all were in, be it music or post audio, films, television, mostly early on in 5/1, 7/1, and in that world for a long time until Atmos came down the pike.
Yeah, I seem, because I hear a lot of people, and it seems like everybody came in from records and music. I know a lot of you guys did. That's where I came from. Now I think they're all coming in because music's not where it used to be. I think they all come from gaming now. I think a lot of people are influxing from games into TV and movies because they have the knowledge. And I think my biggest recommendation is to move to where the work's at, and then get involved with the community. I know, Tom, you were from San Diego, you moved up to LA, and Andy, you were from Canada, I mean, you got to come in where people are doing the work, and then you just find a way to learn and maybe become an assistant and then grow into it and start learning the language of who the players are, who the companies that hire are, and then spend the time and do it.
And spend the time to learn the technology. You have to put in the homework to learn how to use the stuff. You have to spend the time to learn how to use Pro Tools. Well, now Atmos comes along, you have to spend the time to dig into the box and figure out how it works and figure out how the panners and objects work, and watch some webinars and YouTube videos and whatever it takes to practice and get your skill so you can use it.
I've been doing this for 400 years now, and I'm still watching YouTube all the time. There's so much to learn, and and just hearing different people's thoughts. I wish we had YouTube when I was younger.
Or to watch a panel like this. I'm learning from these guys, just listening to what they're saying. It's great to hear other people, how they work and what they do.
Yeah, the other 2 panels that we had blew my mind. And they were so advanced, especially the first panel. We had Bill Johnson was on, and Andrew Sheps, and they were very technical, and it was just some amazing stuff that as professionals, I was like, wow, Andrew was learning a lot. He kept going, wow, this is like, I got to apply that. So I think it's great that we're doing this and you guys, donated your time. Okay. Here's a question. Probably somebody's a gamer. Do you use Reaper?
No.
And moving on. Okay, so Reaper's a really cool program. It's wonderful for gaming. Mixing, I've never been a big fan of it. Sound creation is pretty cool. And it works really well on a PC for those people that are PC based. Yeah, I know it doesn't have to be used for gaming, but though I know it's pretty popular in gaming. Okay, is it wait a minute, make sure I don't. Okay, is it assumed that QC is being done on all near field 5.1 systems?
I think so, either that or headphones.
Yeah.
I think more often it's headphones, and they're using a bunch of meters to get readouts, and that's what they're calling stuff on.
Yeah.
One thing I might want to do is I might talk to Isotope, because Isotope can get rid of clicks, which means if they can get rid of it, they can identify it.
Ooh.
So I'm going to talk to Isotope about creating a plugin that will automatically identify clicks. So as you're mixing to go up here, 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 and then all of a sudden this way, as either you're mixing or mastering or print mastering, all of a sudden it's going to give you reports that most likely the QC people will be hearing as well. Just a thought.
Great idea.
All right. I should patent that one. Okay, what do we have? How does Tom Ammerman's spatial audio technology compare to Atmos? Anyone can, I don't know.
I don't know that particular technology, forgive me.
I don't. I do know that what's interesting, which we'll talk about in the next seminar, Apple's coming out with their format, Sony's coming out with their format. I've even been asked one day to do an Atmos mix for a phone. And first I was like, I thought they were wrong. I thought it was a client asking for the wrong thing. And what they're doing is they're actually just creating a binaural render of it. So as you take your phone and move it around with head tracking, you can hear like different things from an ADM file. So I thought, okay. When mixing Atmos for Netflix, how often do you find yourself exceeding recommended 2.3 dBTP? I personally use 3 beds and 10 objects, and in busy action scenes sometimes find that the only way to meet the spec is to go really low on my output limiter's ceiling.
I don't think that they any longer require that the Atmos actually meets that as a sum. So, there was a point where Netflix was saying that, the sum, obviously you can't put a limiter on to the sum because you don't know what the output is. Right. And so they were saying that the sum couldn't true peak over -2.
Yeah.
And that was a problem, and they kind of figured that out. And so now they say that, if basically none of the channels can go over that, but the sum is not held to that.
Yeah, we had the same thing where it failed QC, but then came back from Netflix and said, no, as long as your beds and everything are not peaking, we're happy.
Yeah, I mean, -2 dB, true peak is I've always thought it also kind of makes sense.
And yeah. So you might need to set your limiter depending on what it is to -2, 3, as he was saying, to get it to that.
Yeah. Okay, the next question. Hello, everyone. Any expectations developed for VR metaverse adaptations for mixes? Which I guess would go through binaural. It's basically taking your mixes, putting it through binaural renderer, and Okay.
We haven't talked about it much, but I think you're right. I think that would be the best use of binaural to service the metaverse.
Yeah, I ended up going to Technicolor for a little bit, and I was kind of in charge of the whole immersive thing. So I learned a lot. But the reality, what I learned was the market's very fragile.
Yeah.
You know, I did VR and AR and all the ARs for about 2.5 years. And I met with, you know, Google and Facebook, and it was a wonderful experience from a certain perspective. But we quickly realized that the consumer isn't there yet. And they're not, you know, I think the big VR push, you know, and everything else, you know. I know we've got a couple more. I'm going to rush. We don't have that many. Okay. Thanks for taking the time, everyone, since we're all working at home now, except for Frankie. Does anyone make extensive use of binaural before going to the stage? Yeah, you guys listening to a binaural to be able to hear your stage.
Yes, that has worked. As I said, Smith Electronics has this box that captures an impulse of your room, and it's amazing. Even if there's weird little nodes in the room that you know are imperfections, it captures those, and you have to take your headphones off. It's so unbelievable in terms of being accurate and transparent to hear that you're actually not on headphones.
Yeah.
And I've done it at Sony. That the virtual mixing environment works really well, and it's it's as Tom says, it's unique to your head. So a generic kind of an Apple spatial audio isn't going to work, and I think that's why imaging your head, the way that when I went to Sony, they captured the impulse. You know, put these little earphones in there and shot impulses and captured my shape of my head, and you impose that onto the impulse of the room, and it's very accurate. In combined with head tracking, it's incredible. It really sounds like you could take that now and have whatever the Hitchcock. You could have whatever theater you want, at home in a really good headphone environment. So it does work exceedingly well.
Yeah, and interesting that you said it, because when I was yakking with Will when I first heard about it, because I like my toys. My first question to him was, how do you deal with the sub? Because that becomes a visceral, physical thing as well. Yeah. And he said actually uses headphones and a sub. So it's probably weird, like if someone's listening to it, you'll hear coming from his room, and he's got headphones on. So
I hear. That's funny.
But yeah, because I use a lot of sub. I like sub.
You want to feel it.
I want to reach out and touch my audience. Okay.
You need the appropriate jacket or vest.
Yeah, there you go.
It's actually in the chair.
In the kidneys, right?
It's in the seat of your chair.
Yeah. Any preferred plug-in level meters? What do you guys use for metering?
The Nugent.
Yeah. Visual
Nugent, Insight.
Yeah. Insight's great too. Yeah, Insight 2 is wonderful.
Anybody else?
The best thing about Nugent is that it keeps the history. So you can, once you've tracked the show, you can go back and update, and it keeps updating your LKFS. So that's pretty huge.
It is good. Yeah, wherever you drop the needle, it'll give you an accurate representation of the levels.
Someone asked a similar question. Are there any hardware level meters other than the S6? What is the 79? How interesting. Okay, first of all, are you guys using any hardware meters? The second question is, as we referred to, playing back at 79, what would you equate that to a VU meter? That would be basic 0, but you don't have the Peon +3, because we're all like.
It's actually interesting, because I think we all were used to using the Duro meter and a combination of Duro and VU. And I recently put them up in my window to have the virtual versions of them. And if you get used to looking at it, it's actually, it's kind of nice to see an analog type meter again. So, and it does relate the on the Duro meter hitting the peaks of 0 translated very closely to a -24 LKFS.
Wow.
I always loved even the 0 VU bouncing at 0 was actually very close to -24 LKFS.
That's assuming you set up your room correctly. I mean, that's also assuming you set up levels in your room correctly and all that. So that's
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys miss the old? I remember Tadio. They used to have these like washing machine based boxes that had meters by the screen.
Right.
You could see all the meters as you were looking at the screen. Anybody miss any of that?
At Warner Brothers, it's not always functional because it's old technology, but we have basically TVs, that are a single, VU meter for each of the channels right below the screen. And even though like I don't mix based on seeing those meters, it's really handy to see that, monitor level based meter, just to verify, yeah, I'm hearing that channel, or this thing is tilted over there. There's something, so at a sort of like basic level, it's very handy to have something that's attached to, getting a parallel feed to what's going to your monitor.
Or even looking at your recorder and looking at the mix page and seeing the multi-track stems
Yeah.
to tell where stuff is panned and what information you're sending to those different channels.
Yeah.
We got a question from Christina, which we could kind of quickly answer. She was, what are the different target loudness levels for sub and surrounds? And I said, usually we just go through the Dolby format, whether you're down 3 or Atmos, you're not down at all. Subs tend to be +6 to give it a fighting chance. But then it depends. Oh, so here's actually a different question. For you guys at home, or when you've worked on systems, so you've got an LFE and you've got bass extension. So one of it is bass management. Are you using the same subs or different subs to do both?
Unfortunately, the same.
Yeah, me too.
What are you using, Tom?
When I'm mixing, I have no bass well, no matter what I'm doing, I have no bass management on the LCR because I've got M2s that are 15-inch woofers, and so they can handle everything. The sub is a dual 18 sub, so it's, plenty big for the room. And I do bass manage surrounds if I'm mixing in Atmos so that I get the full range. And if there's some low end, sometimes you get something that's never been filtered and there's some 5-10 hertz thing that's just like going, and if you don't know that's there, you're in trouble later. But yeah, I don't use the bass management on the LCR because I have big enough speakers that can give you
I think to your point though is I think if you're doing Atmos, you should bass manage. If you're doing 5.1 or 7.1 discrete, you shouldn't use bass manage.
And Andy, what are you using with your
well, I'm only doing dialogue at home, so it doesn't matter a lot, but I don't use bass management on the LCR as well. I've got subwoofers on each of the Barefoot, so they don't need it.
Now, what software are you using or hardware to separate if you have one sub, how are you feeding both bass managed sound and LFE sound separately? How are you doing that inside the box?
For me, I BSS based, so I've built a chain that allows me to turn on bass management. So I can turn it on for LCR. I can turn it on and off for the surrounds, the overheads, and I used to have multiple subwoofers. So I had dedicated subs for bass management and LFE separate, and for surrounds, and I had a sub back in the back of the room to handle the surrounds and overhead. And I just found that it was a little bit messy in the room because I'm not in some gigantic room, a theater or something, and it really wasn't necessary. And I ultimately have a clearer low end when I just use the one dual 18 sub that I have.
Right.
I think for the mere mortal people that just have a simple system, the Dolby the suite provides built-in management. You can just go turn it on and on. You can on and off. You can choose the crossover frequency, and it works pretty well for just giving you that ability to have bass management on your surrounds.
Fantastic. And then Christina's asked one more, and this is simply, how do you set the levels for your room correctly? A sound level meter. Radio Shack used to have one when they were around, and they could use it on your phone.
Yeah,
I'm still
phone app is great.
App, phone app.
One of these is
Yep.
still, yep, it's like right
Yeah.
by me, so I can, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And make sure and turn bass managements off before you start tuning your speakers.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're starting to wrap up here. First of all, I want to thank all of you guys. Just excellent. I'm huge fans of all of you. And I think this is great, you know, doing these panels, and especially for a combination of students as well as experts, as well as people that are, you know, in the business doing this work. I always like to think we're doing a master class, but at the same time, this will be on YouTube for, you know, for your grandkids to watch. And scary thing, huh? And anyway, so I want to thank you. Let me just go do my thank yous and my whole spiel at the end. So obviously, I thank you guys. Thank you. I also want to thank Sherry Klein, Richard McKernan, Maureen Droney, Bernard Weiser, Karen Dunn, Andrew Sheps for moderating the first two panels. Good buddy of mine, just did wonderful job. And then Karen Dunn, who is just, you know, making all this possible for us, and all the folks that have been helping out. I also want to thank, you know, EIPMA wouldn't exist without all the organizations that help support it. So we want to thank them, and feel free for those people to become active in those groups. MPSC, CAS, they have some great classes as well. There's a picnic coming up on MPSC. Go to it, bring the kids. It'll be a fun time. Next week, coming up on the next series, the next episode of Lost in Translation, I'm going to be bringing on Harry Cohen, Scott Kramer, John Taylor, Jamie Scott, and Mandel Winter. We're going to be talking about Atmos design, and we're going to get more into also, like we were talking about, how to create. Everyone's working at home now. All the editorial seems to be working at home a lot. Mixers hit and miss. So really, there's going to be a whole discussion of how do things translate, how are you dealing with Atmos, because most editors don't have Atmos home systems. So we'll be discussing all of that. But stay tuned. That is not next Saturday, but 2 weeks from now. There's a whole bunch of links. Also, EIPMA is a nonprofit organization. Feel free to donate. None of us get paid. We're just doing it. So there's just a lot of things that need to happen. So we're only as good as the people that watch, and we want to keep these for free. We're not charging for these. So because of that, we do accept your donations. Karen, am I forgetting anything? I know you're here somewhere.
No, I think we're good. Everybody can just say goodbye and see you on the 22nd.
All right. So thank you, everybody. Thank you guys for participating.
Thank you so
I know
much.
you won.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.